Добрый вечер, уважаемые коллеги.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Now we are beginning our panel devoted to research of xenophobia and anti-Semitism, methods, forms and problems. The problem of research in this area is quite complex. But today we have very powerful speakers and presenters. There will be 7 speakers, which is really much for one panel discussion. So 8 to 10 minutes maximum per person. And I would like to leave some more time, if possible, for questions to be asked from the audience, by the audience, in order to clarify certain issues for the speakers. As there is actually very little time, I will be very brief. And I ask the speakers to keep to their schedule. I would like to say that I have received confirmation from the organizers of the Congress that in the near future we will set up a special online workshop for deeper discussion of these issues. Because, of course, the problem of methods and factors which determine the dynamic changes in anti-Semitism and xenophobia are very difficult, and it's a very comprehensive and diverse topic. Apart from this, I'm quite sure that it is hard to speak about any one understanding of the nature of anti-Semitism or xenophobia or racism. It very largely depends on the context, the cultural, the political context, the presence of any organizations which can mobilize for their support the radical elements, and on the state policy, which just the same can either control manifestations of anti-Semitism. I can tell you from my experience of more than 30 years research on xenophobia and anti-Semitism, I know that this problem cannot be solved totally. Its notion is to control a certain level, to not permit the most unacceptable forms, the most aggressive forms of this. So it's very important to analyze the types of these forms of xenophobia and anti-Semitism, and correspondingly the causes and factors and consequences of their dynamic changes. But I would like to ask to begin speaking one of the most prominent researchers in this area, Professor Sergio Della Pergola. Professor Sergio Pergola, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Gudkov. Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be again in Moscow, although virtually. We can put the PowerPoint I have predisposed. My topic begins with addressing the question of definitions of anti-Semitism, which has been very much in the headlines recently. and I asked several questions. Essentially, what is and is there a sufficient relationship between these worthwhile attempts to conceptualize anti-Semitism and the situation in the field? And what I noticed, please put my PowerPoint on, what I noticed is that very much has been done by historians, by philosophers and political scientists, but the empirical social sciences, of which I am one exponent, has been left practically out. What I maintain is that fundamentally the answer to the question of what anti-Semitism is should be given to the people. That is, ask the people and see what they feel, what they perceive, what is in fact the mental structure of their perceptions, and then starting from that try to create a more theoretical framework. Now you can move to the second and to the third. Please move two slides ahead, because the first I have already covered. And go ahead. What I present, and I hope it's visible, is what we call structural analysis of data. We have a big survey in 12 European Union countries undertaken in 2018 under the sponsorship of the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union in Vienna, and with the central help of the JPR in London. We had 16,000 interviews obtained through the internet in 12 countries, and by analyzing the statistical correlations between different variables, there is a method known as SSA to present the statistical numbers in graphical fashion. That is, correlations that are strong are represented by points on the map that are close, and correlations that are weak or contrary are represented by points that are distant. I very briefly succinctly want to say that the first slide shows the conceptual contents of anti-Semitism. As you can see, the space is clearly partitioned in two horizontally. That is, in the upper part, you have what we call the cognitive or conceptual moment of how people perceive certain negative expressions in terms of anti-Semitism. Would it be possible to make the picture bigger, because I don't think anything can be seen. It is very small. And in the bottom part, it is the experiences of people who have actually heard those negative statements. But the interesting thing is that exactly, thank you. The vertical partition from right to left shows that there are three fundamental components. One is the so-called protocols or classic anti-Semitism, which is expressed by negative expressions about negative characteristics of Jews and their foreignness to the societies in which they live. The central band is related to Holocaust, denial of Holocaust and diminishing of the Holocaust, and exploitation of the Holocaust by the Jews. And on the left, negative opinions about Israel. Israel is the Nazi state. Israel should not exist and should be boycotted. So interestingly, the perceptions of these three main components are very clear in the minds of the Jews, and they also can distinguish between what has really happened to them and what they think might happen but has not happened really. Now we move to the next. The next slide shows the correlations. Again, can you broaden okay, thank you. It is the contents of behaviors and transmission and communication of anti-Semitic concepts and behaviors. And what is important is the partition into four areas of contents. Again, the perceptions which are cognitive and which are experiential are clearly distinguished, yet they form a coherent part of the mental space of our 16,000 European Jews. And we can find an ulterior interesting partition into four elements. Bottom, what I call practical anti-Semitism, that is things that really happen, violence and desecration of cemeteries and the like. Then moving a counterclock to the right, political anti-Semitism, expressed in political reunions, political programs, and political discourse. Then moving up to the upper right corner, what I call populist anti-Semitism, anything that happens in the street, through the media, in the stadium, and which is usually related to quite a low level of education. And then in the upper left, what I call narrative anti-Semitism, which is more characteristic of higher culture academy, the higher media. And it is interesting to see how the left part, what I call the narrative anti-Semitism, includes most of the anti-Israeli messages, whereas the right hand includes most of the Holocaust and classic anti-Semitism messages. Now we turn to the next slide. The next slide adds one further element. The further element is the perpetrators. And so basically putting upon the previous slide certain types of perpetrators, everything as it is perceived by the Jewish population, of course, we find an interesting correlation between right-wing political right and Christian perpetrators more associated with the populist and sort of low education level of anti-Semitism, whereas on the left part, that which I call the narrative, which is characterized by a higher level of intellectual sophistication, is more perceived as coming from the left and also from Muslim circles. There is, in other words, a very clear specialization of the perpetrators in terms of the themes and the channels they use to diminish or to offend the Jews. One other notion which is interesting is the central spot of this graph, which is the internet. That is, the internet is perceived as a kind of coordinating element, and it means that the new media are not only a technical fact, but they have become an integral component of the spread and of basically the contents of current anti-Semitism. I now move to the next slide, which deals with something a little bit different, and that's the components of Jewish identity as perceived by Jews in those 12 European countries, and what is the role of anti-Semitism as one component of Jewish identity. Here we have 8 indicators, and I have roughly classified them in the right part as particular, things that are more typically Jewish, such as religious belief and community activities, and on the left hand, more universal, that is culture. And interestingly, anti-Semitism and the Holocaust appear on the left hand, that is, they are perceived as broader, not parochial or not particular, but more generic and more international and universal aspects of behavior and attitude. What we find, though, and this is a very crucial point in our discourse, is that at the center of the configuration, there is something that, in a sense, is the more central part of the perception, not in terms so much of the frequency, but in terms of the correlation with all other elements in Jewish identity. We have 2 indicators. One is Jewish peoplehood, that is, I belong generically to a Jewish people. And the other one is concern for the state of Israel. These 2 variables are strongly correlated in the mind of many Jews. And it is, I think, fundamental to understand that in the case of contemporary discourse, any attack on one of those components is rapidly perceived as an attack on the other. It is perhaps somewhat instinctive. Some famous biologist, Pavlov, in Russia, developed the Pavlovian mechanism. And this is perhaps what happens. You attack the Jews on Israel, they feel attacked on peoplehood and vice versa. But the important thing is that these are very central perceptions, and they are shared by a lot of Jews in the European continent, I believe so, also in other continents. Now I move to some conclusions. You can put the next slide. And the next slide, if you can expand it a little bit, says basically that structural analysis, we did not have the time to elaborate on the technique, but that can be done on another occasion, shows that European Jews as a collective hold a clearly structured perceptual concept of contemporary anti-Semitism. Along 3 fundamental axes of negationism, the Jew is denied, A, as an individual, the right to enjoy civil, social, cultural, and political equality equal to any other individual in society. And this is the classic anti-Semitism we know from the past. B, as a potential victim of and a survivor of planned extermination, the right to preserve and transmit his/her own authentic memory of the destruction of his own people, the Shoah. You know that there is a big discourse about memory and about the legitimacy of a Jewish memory vis-a-vis general memory, also in a sense the role of Yad Vashem as one mechanism to help preserving that memory. And C, as a member of a national collective, the right to exert corporate national sovereignty through an independent state, Israel, sovereignty which is not denied to any other collective, and in fact is the basis of so many national states of today. Now the next slide. We here gave, can you move to the next slide, a couple of suggestions for continuing research. The mode of proceeding toward a robust definition of anti-Semitism should be iterative, beginning with the formulation of certain hypotheses, of course, regarding the main patterns of anti-Semitism, continuing with the empirical verification of their presence, frequency, consistency, and applicability. Only as an outcome, one may start suggesting the elaboration of a synthetic definition. Much greater attention should be devoted in future research to anti-Semitism, the cognitive, the experiential, and the affective. As you heard, I stressed the cognitive and the experiential, but the affective mode has been totally neglected, or nearly so, and it's very important that we devote attention to it. I mean, the inner feeling of people. Then the practical, populist, political, or narrative modes of expression have to be understood, distinguished, and analyzed. The direct or virtual modes of expansion, channels of communication and manifestation are very important. The characteristics of perpetrators must be analyzed as separate and distinct. And they, of course, interrelations between these various and different aspects have to be understood. And finally, regional variation, which I could not display today across the European Union, clearly emerges from the data and should also be stressed. And so I go to my last statement in the last slide, in which I say that it is important that in the framework of the continuing debate and of the many disagreements that we still have between the IRA definition, which in my own opinion is a good definition, although not really perfect, and what has been suggested as an alternative, the so-called Jerusalem definition, in reality, the Van Leer group definition, which in my view is much poorer and less complete, and also biased to some extent. Our findings carry important implications for in-depth understanding of the issues, for developing new, relevant, and verifiable insights, and for developing, finally, appropriate and effective public and private initiatives to fight anti-Semitism. And with this, I hope I stood within my 8 to 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much, Professor Sergio Della Pergola. And our next speaker is will be by Alvin Hirsch Rosenfeld, Director of the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism in the USA. Alvin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I'm very pleased to participate in this conference. My only regret is that I'm in Bloomington and not in Moscow, but nonetheless, it's a pleasure to join everyone. My own talk, too brief given the bigness of the subject, will in many ways coordinate with what you just heard from Sergio Della Pergola. We didn't rehearse this together, but in many respects, I think we're on the same page with regard to not hardening definitions of anti-Semitism, but picking them up where people feel them, experience them, and the like. With that in mind, I want to put forth quite simply a definition of anti-Semitism that I use myself, and hopefully you will find useful. We might think of anti-Semitism for present purposes as hostility to Jews based on an irrational and exaggerated fear of Jews, resentment of Jews, suspicion of Jews, distrust of Jews, hatred of Jews, etc. While such hostility has been a threatening presence, in numerous countries at various times. What drives it is not always the same, nor are the forms it takes always the same. And for our purposes today, it might be helpful to note at least two significant versions of anti-Semitism. One I'll call social anti-Semitism, and the other political anti-Semitism. Social anti-Semitism is driven by an extreme dislike of Jews. Its goal is social exclusion, the marginalization of people deemed to be unlikable, disagreeable, and so on. When Jews are viewed in this way, the impulse is to keep at a distance from them, ostracize them, or cast them out. Hence the efforts over many years to segregate or exclude Jews from certain neighborhoods, lines of work, social circles, schools or universities, etc. In its most extreme expressions, the proponents of social anti-Semitism seek to banish Jews from the countries where they reside or ghettoize them within restricted areas. And looking at this historically, of course, we recognize that one result was the forced exile of Jews from certain countries in the Middle Ages, and also the establishment of Jewish ghettos in certain cities. By contrast, political anti-Semitism is driven far more by fear than dislike or contempt, and it has different and more destructive goals. Those possessed by such feelings regard Jews as a threat to their very well-being and to the general health and stability of society. They believe that Jews are conspiratorially organized to seize power through their penetration and control of major political and cultural institutions, financial markets, the media, and other areas of civil society. In pursuit of these aims, Jews are allegedly responsible for human suffering on such a large scale as to be nothing less than agents of evil, thought sometimes to be allied with Satan or the devil. They are bent on carrying out demonic deeds on a cosmic scale. Hitler, and forgive me for citing him, but he's relevant, imagined Jews in precisely these terms, referring to them in Mein Kampf, and I quote, as veritable devils. As he put it, their activities, if left unchecked, and I quote him again, must ultimately result in the collapse of human civilization and the consequent devastation of the world. To those who think about Jews in these phantasmagorical terms, the goal is not the social exclusion of the Jews, but their total elimination. Simply to avoid Jews or to keep them at arm's length is not enough. They need to be destroyed. If I were to try to sum up what I just put before you in simple terms, I would quote from Sartre's early book, post-war book on anti-Semitism. These are his words: what the anti-Semite wishes and what he prepares for is the death of the Jew. That encapsulates what I'm calling political anti-Semitism neatly. And for my talk with you today, which is going to at least nod in the direction of anti-Zionist anti-Semitism, I would say what the anti-Zionist wishes and what he prepares for is the dissolution or death of the Jewish state. If what I have just put before you sounds extreme, it is. Unfortunately, it's borne out by a past replete with examples of anti-Jewish exclusion, expulsion, exile, persecution, mass violence, and in mid-20th century Europe, acts of genocide that took the lives of millions of people. It would be comforting to think and believe that that's all part of our past. Let's hope it will be. However, we're living at a time when anti-Semitism, especially its anti-Zionist form, is very energetic, very committed. In the words of Stephen Harper, the former Canadian Prime Minister, anti-Zionism, and I quote him, is the face of the new anti-Semitism. It targets the Jewish people by targeting Israel and attempts to make the old bigotry acceptable for a new generation. The present Pope, Pope Francis, has been equally emphatic, proclaiming, and I quote him, that to attack Jews is anti-Semitism, but an outright attack on the state of Israel is also anti-Semitism. And the British scholar Alan Johnson agrees, noting, and I quote Mr. Johnson, that what the demonized and essentialized Jew once was, demonized and essentialized Israel now is, namely malevolent in its very nature, all-controlling, full of bloodlust, and the obstacle to a better, purer, and more spiritual world. Those who see Israel in these terms, and unfortunately many do, regularly denounce the country as an evil entity or a criminal state and accuse it of the very worst of sins, racism, apartheid, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and even genocide. Some go so far as to liken Israel to apartheid South Africa and even Nazi Germany. The effect of such denunciations is to demonize and delegitimize the Jewish state and to call into question its very right to exist, a right denied to no other state on the globe. Understood in these terms, anti-Zionism is indeed a major and most potentially lethal expression of anti-Semitism in our time. And since the turn of the millennium, anti-Zionist anti-Semitism, one can argue, may be the most dominant manifestation of Jew hatred in our time. There's lots more to say about this, obviously, but my hosts have limited our time. I look forward to taking up these points in the question, answer, and discussion period afterward. Thank you.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much.
И следующий у нас докладчик.
Our next speaker
Главный
is Victor
научный сотрудник Института этнологии.
Shnirelman, Chief Research Institute of Ethnology in Moscow. Thank you. I will talk about the following in my presentation. I'm interested to discover how people become anti-Semites. How do you get there? During this conference, during many other conferences, we've been talking about sociological data, results of polls and monitoring. But the question I'm asking is not really asked that frequently. It is not often analyzed, because an ideology is not an inherent property of a person. You acquire ideology through socialization. So the big question is, when and in what situation do people become xenophobic? Is it rooted in family history? Is it rooted in environment? that children existed in literature that kids read, in interaction with mentors that you meet in life, in your own search and attempts to understand the world around you. Is it defined by social contact? Is it defined by trauma? What causes anti-Semitism? Is it fear of mighty Jews or genuine belief in their flawed nature? What are the sources of this very sensitive and difficult issue? Sociologists usually do polls to understand the general level of xenophobia, but those polls do not answer questions that I'm asking. Cultural anthropologists do in-depth expert interviews. They analyze the discourse, but that does not always allow to fully cover the problem that I've raised. Over the past 20, 25 years, I can think of just two good research of that kind, where sociologists would study lower-level subcultures. So they were looking at how young people become indoctrinated and become members of extremist communities, including skinheads, Nazis, KKK. I can think of a very good research done by an American sociologist in the US, and another research was done in Russia, in Norilsk. So their conclusions were that young people that come from disadvantaged families are seeking a community, a group to belong, that would meet their expectations. And largely, they are invited to those groups by friends. So ideology is a secondary, not primary factor. So but the data I've collected led me to a different conclusion, because I'm studying elitist anti-Semitism, if I may. Not just, underground subcultures, but I'm thinking about leaders, radical leaders and ideologists, people behind that have been publishing anti-Semitic works for years. They're intellectuals that have college degrees, or at least went to college and did not graduate. I've been collecting data for a while, and my sources are really interesting. Back in the 90s, they were fearful. But some 10, 15 years ago, lately, they lost fear. And we're talking about mature people, elderly, some of them, that are writing their biographies. Huge books, 1,000 pages, sometimes even longer. So in great detail, in excruciating detail, because they want to leave a trace. And I've been studying those. So I've collected a set of literature, and I've identified two types, or two paths towards anti-Semitism. There's clearly orthodox anti-Semites that were indoctrinated in their families, and ideology-driven people that became anti-Semitic due to their intellectual work and their life experience. First were guided by emotion, others were guided by reason. First, acquired anti-Semitic feeling, learning from their seniors, from parents, grandparents. They probably heard xenophobic comments as they were growing up. They were following their family members in certain situations, and then it was aggravated by their own experience, which they carefully selected to confirm their convictions. And if we look at biography of the second group, we'll see that they changed their political views, their attitudes, their ideas multiple times during their lifetime. I've looked at books of economic expert Platonov, radical politician Vladimir Osipov, who died. He passed away last year. The remaining two are still alive. Domin, who is a painter, and Ostritsov, who is a doctor. Osipov and Bolshakov are senior. They were teenagers during Stalin's anti-Semitic campaigns of the 40s and 50s, and Streltsov was too young back then. And Platov and Domin were educated after Stalin died. Many of them had university degrees. Platonov graduated from the Moscow Cooperative Institute, Faculty of Economics, Bolshakov Institute from the Institute of Foreign Languages, and Streltsov from the Medical Institute. And Osipov went to History Faculty of MGU, but he was expelled for political reasons. And Domin studied at Mosfilm, film studio, as a painter. So they grew in different situations. So I've analyzed their school years, their younger years, their adulthood. Unfortunately, I don't have much time because I would love to tell about each and every one of them. Maybe at some point I will publish the results of my research. But let me just give you a couple of examples. For instance, in Platonov's family, anti-Semitism was going from one generation to another. The family remembered that they lost lots of property during the civil law, and they were blaming the Jews. And Platonov learned the meaning of the term kike from his grandma, who explained to him that Jews were bad people and you need to keep away from them. So Platonov, since his younger years, was an established anti-Semite. Then, in school, he had fights with Jewish kids. Then, as he went to young pioneer camps, again he had conflicts with Jews. And so it went. And then, in the end of the 60s, past century, he got in touch with the people that were protecting cultural heritage. He was member of the Russian club. And by then, he was already an established anti-Semite. But if we look at others, the situation was different. Their parents were communists, they were growing up as normal kids, they were pioneers and they're members of Komsomol. They were educated in the spirit of internationalism. Some had Jewish friends. And some of them, in the early stages of their career, received help from the Jews. And this is just one of many examples. Vladimir Osipov, let's look at him. He gradually turned into an anti-Semite. When he was younger, he was friends with many artists and painters, some of them Jews. He helped set up their exhibitions. But by the end of the 60s, he decided they were immoral and pro-Satan, and he would sometimes say that he is only against, he's not against all Jews, he's just against the radical streams. But it's really difficult to keep within those limits. So he was accusing Jews of being too liberal, too cosmopolitan, and saying that blood defines mindset. So he was getting racial about it. And unfortunately, I don't have the time to talk about all of them, because their bios are all so interesting. But straight to conclusions. The conclusions are as follows. People became anti-Semitic in a different age for different reasons. Some acquired that in family. And it was aggravated with age, and people would find new reasons to dislike Jews. Others were not anti-Semitic in their younger years, despite manifestations of anti-Semitism they encountered. The third group never encountered any anti-Semitism. In their younger years, they were friends with Jews, they received support in Jews, but then something happened. When people faced injustice, when people were disappointed about ideology, when they started confronting the regime, or experienced difficulties, or were convicted for political reasons, that was aggravated by the activity of Russian nationalist organizations. And I want to stress specifically what was very important is Orthodox Judophobic literature, which equaled Judaism with Satanism, and people that were writing such books were not even interested in the actual history. Or some people that became anti-Semite were servicing the official ideology. There were also some people that became anti-Semites said that Russians and Jews behave differently. And mentors were really important, that unveiled to the young people new pages of Russian history. We really are running out of time. And all of that gave rise not just to Judophobia, but to conspiracy theories. I stop here.
It is very hard for me to cut the speakers short, but nevertheless I ask everybody to stick to the proposed agenda, because otherwise there will just not be enough time for the others. I would also like to comment on what has already been said, but I have to refrain from that with regret. Our next speaker is Alexey Levinson from the Russian Levada Center. Alexey, the floor is yours. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Greetings, colleagues. I would like, in my brief presentation, to devote it to a topic which has been covered many times by the most prominent researchers and intellectuals, the topic which should be called Jews and authority, Jews and the government. But in this very wide area, I would like to take a very narrow aspect, which will be touching upon the relationship of Russian Jews at presently living in the Russian Federation, with the authorities in the name of the currently acting powers authorities headed by President Putin. The foundation, the basis for this topic is the following. Nowadays, probably there's not so much doubt as there used to be previously regarding the results of the Levada Center studies. First, the International Center of Public Opinion polls, which say that anti-Semitism in Russia, in the Soviet Union and in Russia, is at a very low level. And this low level seems to decrease. But there a lot has been said, many words of mistrust regarding these results. And nowadays, all those who are interested in this topic agreed with this observation, while at the same time naming the causes for the decrease of such a decrease of anti-Semitism in Russia, despite quite a high level of it in other countries, namely in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, which is quite close to the borders of Russia and the post-Soviet area. I will not even try to name all the causes for this phenomenon, but I would like to dwell upon the reasons which seem to be visible or clear to the subjects themselves, the subjects of this process, namely the Russian Jews. The Russian Jews explain the situation very simply. Putin is not anti-Semitic personally, or, as it is often formulated, Putin for some reason is not anti-Semitic. This formula has many centuries of experience behind it, of interaction of Jews and the Russian authorities. In the eyes of the Jews, the Russian authority should necessarily be anti-Semitic because it has been so very often that it's an immanent feature. And historically, it has been proved at all steps, except for the current moment, and that Vladimir Putin is not anti-Semitic. And this, in the opinion of the Jews who take part in discussions of this, this sets back the anti-Semitism, which nevertheless cannot help but exist among the Russian authorities. And this, and I will speak more about it later on, means that once Putin's rule is over, the Russian machine of power will spread out its anti-Semitic potential again, will expand it. Now, I am not going to explain why Putin has such settings or such an attitude towards Jews. I do not believe that all the situation can be explained by Putin's personal characteristics, but it is interpreted in such a way. And this makes a very interesting impact on the Jewish community in Russia. I would like to note several aspects here, three in fact. One is a certain embarrassment about these results. Many of the Jews whom we interviewed belong to the liberal wing of the sub-elitary groups, and for them it was characteristic to possess an acute critical attitude to the president and to the authorities in general. And they practice such an attitude, in fact. But this issue that Putin now protects Jews from what would have happened if he were not at the steering wheel. This helps them refrain from criticism. Another result of the study, which we deem very important, is the special impact of such perceptions about the fate of Jews at the temporal vision of the history moving forward, or the vision of the trends going ahead. The interview which we held with the representatives of the Jewish community showed that the Jews view the future of Jews and of Jews in Russia for about 10 years ahead. If we talk to them about further periods, there is an abrupt change of the situation. and an emphatic refuse to discuss these future trends or irrational other type of cliches get switched on, such as Jews have always been and always will be in Russia, and their presence here is due to some irrational circumstances, or the Jews will disappear, every single one of them, because even now they are at the precipice, or, well, all of these forecasts are irrational. But for the 10 years from now, people are willing to discuss quite rationally. 10 years is the approximate period during which, as we know, many Russians expect that our current President Putin will be in some way or other, will be the head of our government, head of our state. I believe that the dependency, which has been mentioned, is quite serious. It actually exists. But our study shows that the future of the Jewish nation is determined more not as much as by the direct relationship between the Jews and the authorities, but the change of the role of the Jews in the Russian society. They stopped playing the role of conductors of modernization and innovation, but not because something went wrong in the world, something changed, but because the whole construction, the involvement of Russia in the world community is happening now with different foundations, and the processes within the society are different, and it is too serious to discuss it at present. I would like to conclude my presentation with saying what happened to anti-Semitism, the anti-Jewish concepts in the receiving society, that is, Russians and other non-Jewish environment. So, being brief, anti-Semitism has not disappeared, but it has changed the sphere of its functioning and its purpose. Anti-Semitism continues to remain a part of the Russian folk culture. I do not mean the elite, is where anti-Semitism is different, but in the mass environment, anti-Semitism as a negative opinion about Jews continues existing. But what is very important, at the present period of time, it is not focused against Jews. It is anti-Semitism, but it is somewhat subdued. It's not active. It is a part of the discourse of the Russians who discuss their internal community problems, socialization, as a rule, involving a mythological creature named a Jew. It is not the really existing Jews in life. There are too few of them, and few know about them. But everybody knows the word Jew. And what is attributed to Jews, everybody knows. So talking to children, to other people, often such cliches are used, Judophobic cliches, to explain certain circumstances. But I'd like to reiterate that it is not leading to any damage for the Jews. But if the situation arises, which there's a concern about, that the authority will be people who will not restrain anti-Semitism, both on the state level and on the everyday level. The existing forms of existence, which now are not headed against Jews, they can to the classical system. This is the end. Thank you very much. Colleagues, it is very hard for me to manage those who are speaking online. If we stay longer, we will prevent the others from speaking of their considerations. Thank you very much once again. And our next speaker is Anatol Boyd, Director of the Institute of Research for Jewish Policy, Jewish Policy Research Institute from the United Kingdom. Jonathan Boyd, please stay to the agenda. Please keep to the time frame.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Gudkov, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Can I have my PowerPoint up on the screen, please? Thank you. So, and we can go straight to the first slide. I follow, obviously, the news about anti-Semitism very closely, and I'm struck by a headline that I see over and over again. And here are just a few examples. Anti-Semitic crime in the US reaches record levels, or anti-Semitic incidents hit all-time high in 2019, or anti-Semitic incidents have reached levels unseen in recent years. And it's the same story repeatedly, anti-Semitic levels rising. And it's very often based on the latest anti-Semitic incident counts coming out of various agencies, Jewish in general, all over the world. And this story matters, it's highly influential, it shapes the discourse about anti-Semitism, the way it's discussed in the media, in politics, in the Jewish community. So I think it's worth taking a closer look at these types of data to determine exactly what they do tell us and indeed what they do not. And that's really what I want to focus on today. And as my starting point, perhaps we can move on to the next slide, I want to take a look at anti-Semitic incident data generated by the UK Community Security Trust, or the CST. The CST has been gathering incident data for decades and in many respects leads the world in this work. Certainly it's inspired many other bodies around the world to undertake similar initiatives. And here are the monthly incident counts running from January 2000 to June 2021. And they appear to show three key things. Number one, incidents spike at particular times. You can see that clearly. Number two, incident levels rose gradually over the first 15 or so years shown here. And number three, incident levels jumped quite dramatically in recent years. Can you just go back to the previous image? The first of these contentions, the spike, is almost certainly true. It's been seen elsewhere around the world, and it directly coincides with the outbreak of conflict in Gaza between Israel and Hamas. That conflict spills over onto the streets of cities all over the world, and Jews are targeted. The second contention, and let's just click forward, is much more questionable. If we could just click forward on the PowerPoint. The climb you can see over the first 15 years or so here is very gradual, but it coincides with a period when the CST was building its brand and becoming increasingly well known in the Jewish community in the UK as the body to which people should report incidents when they occur. And this is a critical point. Anti-Semitic incidents data of this type can never be based on an objective assessment of how many incidents occur. They're always reliant on victims of anti-Semitism going to the trouble of reporting the incident. So any increase shown doesn't necessarily mean that more incidents are occurring. It simply means more incidents are being reported. And no attempt is made in this type of research typically to assess whether the annual increases shown over these years is real or due to improving reporting levels. Now, what of the third contention? And just click forward, please, for me. The recent, rather dramatic jump. It's important to understand one thing. In 2014 and 2015, the CST, very much to its credit, was building closer relationships with and forming better forms of cooperation with the British police. And in so doing, they gradually brokered deals with multiple regional police forces, whereby any incidents reported to the police were subsequently shared with the CST for the CST to incorporate the figures into their own accounts. So prior to the recent jump, the CST was only recording incidents reported directly to them. After it was reporting not only these, but also incidents reported to police forces around the country. In short, and again to stress, very much to their credit, there's no criticism here of the CST at all, but the CST now have multiple channels of information coming into them rather than just one. And that methodological change further reinforces the notion that one can no longer compare the total counts across time. Even putting to one side the reporting issue, we're simply no longer comparing like with like. Next slide, please. The doubts about a recent dramatic jump increase when we compare CST data with incident counts generated by the Service de Protection de la Communauté Juive, the SPCJ, the equivalent body to the CST in France. And just click forward and you'll be able to see the French figures as well. Can we do that? Just click again. Thank you. The counts are rather similar in both countries. Sorry, go back one. The counts are rather similar in both countries between 2005 and 2015, but then they diverge dramatically. And I can only really begin to explain this in two key ways. First of all, the methodological change in the UK, as I've already outlined, and perhaps secondly, the increased police presence on the streets of France to protect Jewish sites following recent terrorist attacks on Jewish targets there. But fundamentally, when you see this picture, particularly at the end in most recent years, you know that something is not quite right here. But there's also a third factor. It's worth noting that the annual counts in France are almost always lower than in the UK, and that's odd for two reasons. First, intuitively, most people would say that the situation in France is worse than in Britain, and indeed, empirically, levels of anti-Semitism in France, as measured using all other known methods, are always found to be worse in France than in the UK. But moreover, secondly, the French Jewish population is at least 50% larger than the UK Jewish population. So on that basis alone, one would probably expect to see more incidents in France than the UK. So what exactly is going on? Next slide, please. Hopefully, this slide helps to explain. This is how the CST on the left and the SPCJ categorize anti-Semitic incidents that they record. You can't see the slide very clearly because it hasn't come out very well, but hopefully I can explain it. They use different categories that overlap to some degree, and the color coding, which is mine, helps to draw comparisons. But what is most striking is that at least 3/4 of the incidents, or more even, recorded by the CST are what they call threats and abusive behavior, by which they mean harassment that's certainly unpleasant, but is fairly low-level anti-Semitism. And by comparison, and here we're looking at the dark blue shade, the SPCJ shows that these types of incidents comprise about 1/3 of all incidents that they pick up, a much lower proportion. So does this mean that that type of anti-Semitism happens much less in France? Well, almost certainly not. It just means that the CST in the UK is better at picking it up than the SPCJ, and the SPCJ is more focused on more serious incidents. So we're not really comparing like with like. Again, the two organizations are measuring anti-Semitic incidents differently. There's another issue we need to be cognizant of, and let's move to the next slide. Over the past decade, the number of incidents recorded on social media by the CST in the UK has climbed dramatically from just 12 in 2011 to 600 to 700 in the last couple of years. And moreover, the proportion of total incidents, if you click again, you can probably see a line. It's also not appearing properly on the PowerPoint. The proportion of the total incidents recorded that are social media related has also climbed dramatically too, obviously, from just 2% in 2011 to approaching 40% of all incidents today. So social media may well be exacerbating anti-Semitism, it probably is, but it may also be uncovering anti-Semitism that was already there, but was previously just spoken in private rather than shared online. And we don't really know which factor is more potent, but we can't ignore the fact, and just click the slide again, or maybe once or twice, there we go, yeah. we can't ignore the fact that there's been a huge increase in the numbers of people on social media over the past decade. Facebook had 766 million users in 2011. Today it has about 2.5 billion. And that provides an unprecedented outlet for expressing views on everything and anything, including views that are clearly anti-Semitic. So again, we don't really know if the jump in anti-Semitism is real, objectively speaking, or if we're simply getting better at recording it, in the UK at least, in part because it can be both expressed and seen much more easily today than in the past because of social media. I'm struck too by the alarmist nature of the headlines that I mentioned at the beginning that almost always accompany anti-Semitic incident data. But if we take a moment to contextualize the figures, i.e. to assess on the basis of the data how many Jews in the UK actually experience anti-Semitism in a given year, and maybe we can move on to the next slide, please. We find that the numbers are actually rather small, about 4 to 7 in recent years in every 1,000. And if we just change the scale of the chart, so move on to the next slide to show this, you can see, we see an almost blank chart. The vast majority, 993 to 996 in every 1,000 Jews in the UK, do not report or do not experience an anti-Semitic incident in each year. And even if we take into account incidents that are not reported, and click again, you should just see the slide change very slightly. The picture changes a little bit, but still, even in the worst case scenario, about 970 in every 1,000 Jews do not experience anti-Semitism in a given year. So just to sum up, as valuable as anti-Semitic incident data are, and they certainly tell us something and have genuine value, they also have really important limitations. Now, there's no time right now to talk about alternative, complementary, or much more coordinated approaches to trying to monitor anti-Semitism over time that I think are needed if there's no time now, to talk about alternative, complementary, or much more coordinated approaches that are needed if we're to be able to use data to help us to fully understand and address anti-Semitism today. But perhaps we can get into that in the discussion. But ultimately, I would just say we need multiple, more sophisticated and coordinated approaches and proper investment in them to really be able to understand how anti-Semitism is shifting or changing or evolving over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. For this, I want to give the floor to our Spanish colleague, Madam Carril, Ana Blanca Carril.
Okay, well, I come from Spain, representing an association coming from the civil society. No, and I want to explain you in a brief what are the challenges we face to collect data and measure this data as an association that are involved in fighting against hate crimes, anti-Semitism, Christianophobia, Judeophobia, and Islamophobia. This is the report that we prepares on a year basis. This is the 2020, no? If someone of you want to take a look at that, you can hear. And what is important and what we use this tool and why we record this data or these cases, no? Because if there is no cases, there is no problem, and we don't have the attention of the authorities, no? So, according to a statement made to the press in April 2021 by Isaac Kerub, President of the Federation of Jewish Communities in Spain until May 2020, Spain is far from being an anti-Semitic country, no? But there is an upward trend in anti-Semitic actions, no? Why? Probably it's because the population professing this religion and the Jewish community is a minority in Spain. We are talking about 40,000 people of 45 million of population. No? So I think this is one of the reasons why we have so small levels. No? We have record around 6 cases in 2020 if we put the focus on the religious side, but if we take into account hate crimes and anti-Semitism as a whole, we can record around 40 cases. No? So. What has been noted in recent years is a trend towards secularism in all areas of public life and a progressive aversion in civil society, especially among young people, to everything related to religion, especially all the misnamed religions of the book. So this is the main point. No? I'm going to show you some comments that we record in our report regarding anti-Semitic attacks. No? Cases of graffiti in a Jewish cemetery, or on a monument to those deported to concentration camps, and on the walls of public roads with comments such as, "Death Jew, good Jew," "Killer Jew, we are going to get you," or "Jews out." No? But we have the same scope with Christians. No? I would like to point out a case that happens in this February, no? Just to let you know how the things are moving. No? It's a demonstration held in February to pay tribute to the soldiers that Franco's dictatorship sent to fight under Hitler's orders in Second World War. No? Leading the demonstration was an 18-year-old girl who launched the following proclamation against the Jewish community: "It is our supreme obligation to fight for Spain, to fight for Europe, now weak and liquidated by the enemy. The enemy will always be the same, although with different masks, the Jew. The Jew is the guilty one, and the Blue Division fought for it." No? This lady is having training in Germany. No? She told her on a TV show. 300 people attended this demonstration, but most worryingly, most of the demonstrators were very young. I'm talking about from 15 years till 20, 25 or so. No? So it's really worrying. But why is there this anti-Semitism? No? What are the roots? We put some of them on the table, and I'm going to go quickly. Anti-Semitism from the political power. I'm talking about BDS campaigns and campaigns based on support for the Palestinian cause. This is very important in Spain. These political campaigns are permitting public opinion and creating a breeding ground in which anti-Semitism can take root. Anti-Semitism from the media, no? Using in many occasions biased language. No? For example, 2 Israeli army soldiers defend themselves from an attack with knives, but the news showed that 2 Israeli soldiers murdered the Palestinian attackers. No? Already the word murder has a connotation not in keeping with the reality of the facts. No? Those who defend themselves murder, and those who commit the aggression attack. So we need to be a little bit. Then lack of education and information, no? On general and recent Jewish history. Some percentages. 66% of Spaniards do not believe that denying the Holocaust is a problem, or 40% of Spaniards surveyed do not know that incitement to violence against Jews is punishable by law. For example, no? And sometimes the victim even doesn't know that he or she is the victim. No? What we want to measure exactly is the pulse, the tone, what is really in the air in the society, no? To know what actions to take, whether proactive, whether reactive, corrective, to evaluate as a traffic light the reality of the evolution of anti-Semitic tendencies, or Judeophobia, Christianophobia, in short, to measure correctly, but to act according to what is really happening, because this is really important for us, no? So we have some challenges to face. First, I could say awareness raising, and personal and material resources are needed. It's necessary to create a network of people in different parts of the country that collect data and inform and take a look at local news or events or conferences. Second challenge, training and definition of terms. I think this is really important to avoid subjectivity and value judgments. Spain adopted the AIRE definition of anti-Semitism recently. And for example, another challenge to face is documenting the cases. We need to have pictures, because if not, we lost credibility. We lose credibility. We need to show that this thing is really happened. The fourth challenge we face is underreporting. We must conduct an information campaign for citizens for being able to know all the cases that happen around the country, because if there is no case, there is no problem. The fifth challenge is to tackle hate crimes and attacks of any kind on social networks, where those responsible for fueling aggressions and hate speech hide behind anonymity. Now, we have the support of law enforcement agencies, but it is not an easy task neither to know all the cases, nor to report them, nor to detect them, nor to stop them. This challenge to have experts in the interpretation of the data collected. Now we have to look for and define what we call the correction coefficients. We could have a single case and be relevant enough to generate concern and maximum alert in society. We can have a lot of cases, but only one could be enough. So, in short, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, the objective we want to achieve is to have a real knowledge of the situation in our country, and that the most effective measures can be taken to prevent anti-Semitism. I can say a lot of more things, but that's all, because we don't have time. Thanks a lot, because we are very alone, because we are an organization for civil society with no funds. All is made by volunteers, so thanks a lot for...
Mil gracias.
The equipment is tired. Chaim Ben Yaakov. Unfortunately, you don't have much time. But last but not least, over to you. Chaim Ben Yaakov. Could you please turn my presentation on? And I will try to be very brief. Dear friends, it gives me great pleasure to be part of this outstanding panel, together with Sergio Della Pergola, Professor Rosenfeld, Alan Cooperman. Dear friends, allow me to start by introducing a publication that was issued just recently. And Professor Gudkov was one of the co-sponsors, and so was Professor Levinson, that are our today's panelists. So it's called Anti-Semitism, Tolerance, and Historic Memory at the Post-Soviet Space. This paper was published by the Eurasian Congress, and the idea was to summarize a lot of data we collected as we monitored anti-Semitism, and we tried to draw some conclusions on anti-Semitism, tolerance, and historic memory. Colleagues are well aware, probably, that there are many organizations and institutes that monitor the situation today. This is why we, the Congress, decided not to do monitoring. Ministry of Affairs of Diaspora, Center for European Jewish Research of the Tel Aviv University, Anti-Defamation League of the US, State Department report level of religious freedoms in the world, Sava Analytical Center do monitoring. Then there's a group that monitors rights of national minorities in Ukraine. There's a United Jewish Community in Ukraine. This is not an extensive list of organizations that monitor this problem in the largest Jewish community of Eurasian region in Russia and Ukraine. So our paper is primarily an attempt to compare methodologies that those organizations use. And one of the very interesting conclusions I want to introduce, one of many, is as follows. We noticed that a share of pessimists among Jews in Russia and Ukraine, next slide please, is 4 times lower, roughly, 4 times lower than among 12 EU member states we've looked into. We've asked a question about the level of anti-Semitism today, according to our respondents. 38% think that it's unchanged, 20% were unable to answer, 22% said it was going down, the level of anti-Semitism, and 14% think that it went up. By the way, we published this report, and it's available in Moscow in hard copies, and we will publish the soft copy online in the hours to come. Next slide, please.
The materials of our report indicate that at the post-Soviet area, the norms which criticize public manifestation of ethnic inequality and unacceptance are denied. That is, the society and the authorities do not require manifestations of ethnic inequality. So this is denied. Next slide, please.
Гудков, который сегодня здесь выступал, представил нам 2 интереснейшие статьи.
Professor Gudkov mentioned an article, which is there's also materials about our major study, which we carried out in 5 countries of the post-Soviet area: Russia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus. And we registered that in all the countries, only 26% personally encountered anti-Semitism, while 27% know a victim, and 24% have never encountered any anti-Semitism manifestations. In Russia, according to the recent, it is 35%, while only 20% encountered it personally. So Russia is a quiet bay from the point of view of anti-Semitism. I'm coming back to 2 articles published by Professor Gudkov, which is a very approximate infographic for the audience, who also determines that there is no clear anti-Semitic concept in the Russian society. But as Professor Gudkov has mentioned Latin anti-Semitism. This article is very important. What is latent anti-Semitism in Russia? This is a topic that we need to be very careful with. Anti-Semitism has not disappeared, though it is manifested weaker than in the Western countries, especially where it is registered against the background of conflicts in the East. A very important article, and I wanted to note Ukrainian author Professor Gudkov from Lviv, which is devoted to characteristics of Ukrainian anti-Semitism, and it shows that the Ukrainian history at the same time demonstrates all the codes, all the anti-Semitism. So it shows the ambivalence and recommends to avoid simplified explanations of this very complex notion, which can which cannot show everything that we are seeing. The factors of anti-Semitism show a unique notion. The difference of understanding the scale of anti-Semitism by Jews on the one hand, and the data of official monitorings on the other hand. 40% of the respondents of the Levada Center accepted that during the last 5 years they have personally encountered threats, attacks, and other types of aggression. 54% had the option to understand, to suppose that the attacks were due to anti-Semitic causes. And this was against the background of a low level, which registered all the monitoring related to anti-Semitism. Similar data for the similar problem were received as a result of a big study in many countries, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and we carried out this study in 2020. We carried out this study, and this study is shown in the article on dynamic of the anti-Semitism, Professor Hanin, who shows to us that there's a certain discrepancy on the monitoring. Now, coming back, I try to shorten down my presentation, and in some cases, in some materials for our presentation, we sum up the research carried out and published in Professor Gudkov's study about the relationships of non-Jews and the Jewish population. What is the anti-Semitism manifested in? For example, the fact that Jews avoid physical labor. Could we have the next slide, please? On page 9, it said that they avoid physical labor, and the next. That another phrase, that Jews take up too much time in the cultural life of Russia, and only 15% believe that it would be better if there were no Jews in Russia.
взгляды.
And the positive, next file,
позитивное отношение к евреям, что евреи порядочные
and the positive, the belief that Jews are positive people, they're decent people. 80% believe that there are many talented people in Russia. So all this illustrates
Это все к вопросу о
the issue of
восприятии
perception
латентного
of latent, the problems of latent anti-Semitism.
Интересный
An
результат
interesting result
в статье, опять же, профессора Гудкова
in Gudkov's article, comparison with the Soviet times.
в России
And in Russia, 36% believe that there is now less or significantly less anti-Semitism.
слайд.
Next slide, please.
42%
42%
евреев в России
believe that Jews in Russia have too much power in economy, policy, and media. And 67%
что мир был бы лучше, если бы не было Израиля.
believe that life would be better if it were not for Israel. Now let us skip
На странице 16
to page 16.
на вопрос за последний год встречали в России
To the
людей.
question, have you met last year in Russia people who would mention the following? That 77% answered positively that there are too many Jews. The Jews have too much power in Russia.
Спокойность у нас, пожалуйста, следующий слайд.
We are particularly concerned by
Новое явление,
a new notion of denying and decreasing the problem of Holocaust.
видим некое заметное
We see
появление
a significant
наблюдениях за
observation.
И это несмотря на то, что 87%
This is despite the fact that 87%, let's have the next slide please, 87%
что такое Холокост.
know about Holocaust,
15% в России
but only
слышали
13%
ничего об
have never heard about it.
Следующий слайд. Посмотрите, пожалуйста, что 79%
77%
никогда
in
не
Russia
сталкивались с отрицанием Холокоста.
have never encountered denial of the Holocaust,
Говорят о том, что иногда. Это свидетельствует,
and 15% say that never.
благодаря усилиям еврейской общины и исследователей
This shows that owing to
на повестке
the efforts of Jewish centers, this problem is seen. Let us see page 21.
светлости,
In fact, what is the pale of residence? 75%
У нас
cannot answer this. Well, unfortunately, we are running out of time. Yes, I understand.
5%
75%
с ответом, это к вопросу о том, что население
are uncertain. This shows that the population is not very familiar with the Jewish content. Similar story with Zionism. 36% have never
с этой историей. Если можно
encountered this.
страницу,
Let us see page 24, please.
внимание о том,
I would like to draw your attention to this reference, this link, where you can visit our website,
Евразиатский еврейский
the
конгресс.
Eurasian Jewish Congress, Anti-Semitism, and see this
Уважаемые коллеги,
book fully. Dear colleagues, we have prepared this book in order to
мнений могли
the leaders of the opinions to
решения. И
be able to take
решение образования
good, reasonable actions, because we believe that education and awareness raising is a priority. Thank you very much. Well, unfortunately, we are beyond all time limits, and I would like to sum up briefly. Even though we have very little time,
выступающие акцентировали
the speakers emphasized a few very important issues for further studies. First of all, what Professor Pergola has mentioned, the structure of anti-Semitism. The second problem, which was mentioned, is the causes of anti-Semitism and the impact of methods of centralization and ideological sources of the aggressive anti-Semitism. The third problem is the problem of social media. They are either a catalyst or a form of manifestation for anti-Semitism. And the fourth, which Alexey Levinson has mentioned, and the last speaker, the problem of latent anti-Semitism. How anti-Semitism is manifested in the presence of Jews. Anti-Semitism without Jews, because under current conditions, the absolute majority in Russia have never personally encountered Jews. How it is carried out, what are the stereotypes? And this should be mentioned. And it can be the cause of a possible seminar in the future, which would be devoted to the forms and methods of study. Thank you very much to all the participants and speakers. I apologize for having been strict and rigid, or maybe not sufficiently rigid, in the moderation and keeping on time. Thank you very much to everybody once again. Have a nice evening.